That bridge stays open. We built it for the community.
That's what the HOA president shouted at a concrete contractor standing on the bank of my Tennessee riverfront property while I was 280 miles away supervising a highway expansion project outside Dallas. By the time my neighbor called me, the final support beams were already in place. By the time I got home, the bridge was finished. The concrete was still curing. The guardrails still smelled like fresh paint. Families were already driving across it. Golf carts rolled over it every few minutes. Children rode bicycles from Silver Creek Estates to the county road on my side of the river. The HOA president stood near the entrance in a bright pink blazer, smiling for photographs. What that woman did not know was that half the bridge sat on land I had owned for more than a decade. What she also did not know was that every survey marker, every easement filing, every riverbank boundary study, and every property deed was still sitting exactly where my father taught me to keep them, locked inside a fireproof cabinet. The bridge looked impressive. It probably cost over $1 million. The residents loved it. The county commissioners praised it. The local newspaper called it a triumph of community planning. Not one of them had bothered to ask who owned the land underneath it. I did not yell. I did not threaten anybody. I sat on the porch of my river house that night with a cup of coffee and started reviewing property records. Tell me, what would you have done? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and support the channel by subscribing. The riverbank was the first thing my father ever showed me when I was old enough to walk. Thomas Mercer bought that property in 1988 after returning from years of construction work throughout the Southeast. He was 6'2", broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they had been carved out of oak. He could rebuild a diesel engine from memory. He could survey property lines with nothing but a compass and a measuring chain. And he trusted paperwork more than he trusted people. Dad used to say that land was only yours if you could prove it. Every fence post, every corner marker, every deed, every tax receipt. He kept copies of everything. When he died 6 years ago after a long battle with pancreatic cancer, he left me 87 acres along the eastern bank of the Cumberland River. The riverfront was never meant to become a housing development. It was never supposed to become a shortcut for wealthy homeowners. Dad dreamed of building a workshop there, a place where veterans could learn trades, a place where young people could fix engines instead of scrolling on phones, a place where neighbors could actually know each other. My name is Caleb Mercer. I'm 45 years old. I'm a civil engineer. Most of my career has been spent building roads, bridges, and infrastructure projects throughout Texas, Oklahoma, and Tennessee. The irony of someone building a bridge on my property without permission is not lost on me. For the last 5 years, work kept me away from home more often than not. Project after project, contract after contract. I always planned to return permanently. Life simply kept getting in the way. The property sat quiet during those years. The taxes were paid, the insurance stayed current, the boundaries never changed. Or at least, I thought they hadn't. The woman responsible for changing that was Victoria Langford. Victoria was 42 years old. She had shoulder-length white hair, expensive jewelry, and a collection of bright pink business suits that made her impossible to miss in a crowd. People who barely knew her described her as
I understand
confident.
the timeline,
People
but we
who
need
knew her
assurances
better
on the
used
regulatory hurdles
different words.
first.
Controlling, vindictive, relentless. Victoria became president of the Silver Creek Estates HOA 3 years earlier. Since then, she had managed to place allies on nearly every committee connected to the neighborhood. Residents learned quickly that disagreeing with Victoria usually created problems. The morning after I returned, I drove to the bridge. Seeing it in person felt worse than seeing photographs. The structure stretched across the Cumberland River like it had always belonged there. Luxury SUVs crossed it, cyclists crossed it, delivery trucks crossed it. Nobody seemed concerned that a private bridge had suddenly appeared. Nobody seemed concerned about who owned the property underneath it. Later that afternoon, I ran into Deputy Ethan Brooks. Ethan and I played football together in high school. At 44, he was still lean, calm, and steady, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never had to. When he saw me staring at the bridge, he simply shook his head. "So you finally seen it?" "When did they build it?" "About 18 months ago." I looked back at the bridge. 18 months? Ethan nodded. Then he lowered his voice. "Be careful, Caleb." "Why?" "Victoria has friends in county government." That answer told me everything I needed to know. The next day, I met Margaret Holloway. Margaret was 73 years old, a widow, sharp-eyed, small in stature, impossible to intimidate. She invited me onto her porch after hearing I was back in town. The moment I mentioned Victoria's name, her expression hardened. "That woman tried to buy part of my property 2 years ago." I looked up. "What happened?" "I told her no." Margaret smiled without humor. "Victoria doesn't handle no very well." That evening, I unlocked my father's fireproof cabinet. Then I drove to the county records office the following morning. 4 hours later, I spread every document across a conference table. The original surveys, the updated GIS maps, the boundary reports, the riverbank studies, the property descriptions, the bridge construction alignment. I checked the measurements once, then twice, then a third time. The answer never changed. Every coordinate matched, every survey marker matched, every legal description matched. The bridge wasn't near my property. It wasn't next to my property. It wasn't partially touching my property. The bridge was built directly on my land. And for the first time since coming home, I realized exactly how much trouble Victoria Langford was about to have. The following Thursday evening, I walked into the Silver Creek Estates clubhouse carrying a leather document case that had belonged to my father. The clubhouse sat on a hill overlooking the river. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the water. Expensive landscaping surrounded the entrance. Everything about the place projected wealth. The parking lot was packed. Luxury SUVs, new pickup trucks, golf carts lined up near the entrance. Word had apparently spread that the owner of the riverfront property was finally showing up. Inside, nearly 100 residents filled the room. Some looked curious, some looked annoyed. Most simply looked confused. At the front stood Victoria Langford. She was wearing another bright pink suit, this one paired with pearl earrings and matching heels. Her white shoulder-length hair was perfectly styled, and her confident smile suggested she believed the evening would go exactly as planned. The moment she saw me enter, she smiled wider, not because she was happy to see me, because she thought she already knew how this story ended. "Mr. Mercer," she announced into the microphone, "I understand you have concerns regarding our community bridge." A few residents turned toward me. I stood calmly. "I don't have concerns," I replied. "I have ownership documents." That drew a few murmurs. Victoria laughed, actually laughed, not nervously, not politely, the kind of laugh people use when they think someone beneath them has said something ridiculous. Then she looked around the room. "Folks, this is exactly the problem we've been dealing with." More smiles appeared around the audience. Victoria pointed toward the river visible through the windows. "That land sat unused for years." She paused dramatically. "Nobody lived there. Nobody developed it. Nobody contributed anything to this community." Several residents nodded. Victoria continued. "The bridge has increased property values throughout Silver Creek Estates." More applause. "The latest estimates show millions of dollars in added value." The applause grew louder. I waited for it to finish. Then I opened my document case. The room became quieter. I placed copies of the survey maps on a nearby table. "The bridge sits on my property." Victoria rolled her eyes. "Oh, please." I slid the county survey toward her. "The legal description is right there." She didn't even look down. Instead, she crossed her arms. Your property sat abandoned. It wasn't abandoned. It was unused. It was privately owned. The distinction mattered. Victoria clearly didn't care. She leaned toward the microphone. The HOA has every right to make improvements that benefit the community. I noticed several residents exchanging uncertain looks. Not everyone seemed convinced anymore. I decided to keep my voice calm. I'm not asking for a fight. The room became silent. I'm willing to discuss a legal agreement. I'm willing to negotiate access. I'm willing to work with the community. For a brief moment, I thought reason might actually work. Then Victoria smiled again, that same smile, the one Ethan had warned me about. Absolutely not. The room shifted. Even some residents looked uncomfortable. Victoria continued. If you interfere with bridge access, the HOA will pursue legal action. There it was. Not a compromise, not a discussion, a threat. I gathered my documents and left without another word. The meeting continued behind me as I walked into the night, but something interesting happened before I reached my truck. Someone called my name. Mr. Mercer? I turned. The woman approaching looked to be in her late 60s, tall and thin with short silver hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. It was Margaret Holloway. She carried a thick folder under one arm. I think you need to see something. 20 minutes later, we sat on her back porch overlooking the river. Margaret spread dozens of printed emails across a patio table. Some were years old, others were only months old. The pattern became obvious almost immediately. Victoria had pressured residents repeatedly. Complaints, warnings, threats, fines, demands. Anyone who opposed HOA projects seemed to receive special attention. Margaret pointed to one email. This one was sent after I refused to sell my property. I read it twice. The language was carefully written, not openly threatening, but intimidating enough that the message was clear. Cooperate or suffer consequences. How many people received these? I asked. Margaret sighed. More than you'd think. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. The bridge wasn't the first controversial project. It was simply the biggest. That discovery kept me awake most of the night. The next morning brought another surprise. At 6:14 a.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. Caleb Mercer. A male voice responded. My name is Daniel Pierce. I immediately recognized the name. Daniel was one of the 7 HOA board members. I'd prefer this conversation remain private. His voice sounded nervous. Daniel was 52 years old, a retired financial analyst with thinning brown hair and the cautious manner of someone accustomed to examining details before making decisions. Unlike Victoria, he wasn't charismatic. He wasn't loud. He was the kind of man who spent hours reviewing spreadsheets while other people made speeches. I voted for the bridge project, he admitted, but something never felt right. I stayed silent. Daniel continued. Victoria handled most of the paperwork herself. That got my attention. Meaning? Meaning the board never saw all the original documents. A long pause followed. Then Daniel spoke again. I think you should see something. We agreed to meet later that evening in a diner 20 miles outside town, a place far enough away to avoid unwanted attention. Daniel arrived carrying a large cardboard tube. His hands shook slightly as he sat down. Without saying much, he slid the tube across the booth. Inside was a full-size engineering drawing. Original bridge construction plans, the actual plans. Not the version presented at HOA meetings, not the version filed with residents, the original version. I unrolled it carefully across the table. At first, everything looked normal. Bridge dimensions, structural notes, drainage specifications. Then I noticed something. Property boundaries. I compared them to the copies from the county survey. The lines didn't match. I checked again. My stomach tightened. Someone had altered the property boundary on the final project submission. Not by accident, not by a survey error. The line had been deliberately moved, just enough to make it appear the bridge avoided my land. I looked up at Daniel. He slowly nodded. Neither of us needed to say it aloud. Victoria Langford hadn't accidentally built a bridge on my property. She had knowingly changed the boundary records before construction ever began. And suddenly this wasn't just a land dispute anymore. It was fraud. I barely slept after leaving the diner with Daniel Pierce's documents. The altered property lines sat on my kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning. Every time I looked at them, the conclusion remained the same. Victoria hadn't made a mistake. She had knowingly moved a boundary line on official project documents before construction began. That changed everything. This was no longer a disagreement over property. It was evidence. The next morning I called someone whose name I had heard for years but never personally needed. Rebecca Foster. If HOA boards had nightmares, Rebecca Foster was usually the reason. Rebecca was 50 years old, tall, athletic, with dark hair streaked with silver and sharp green eyes that seemed to notice details everyone else missed. She had spent nearly 25 years specializing in property disputes, HOA abuse cases, and land rights litigation. Local newspapers occasionally referred to her as the woman who billed HOA presidents into retirement. When I arrived at her office in Nashville, she reviewed my documents in complete silence. Survey maps, boundary reports, construction plans, county filings, the altered bridge drawings. She didn't say a word for nearly 30 minutes. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. Well, I waited. You own the land. I know. You own the bridge approach. I know. And according to these surveys, nobody has any legal easement allowing public access through your property. I felt my shoulders relax slightly. Rebecca nodded. Caleb, you have every right to block access across your land. That was the answer I needed. Can I remove the bridge? She shook her head. Don't touch the bridge. Can I damage anything? No. Can I block my property? Rebecca smiled. Absolutely. Then she slid a legal pad toward me. Place a barrier only on your land. No public road closures, no bridge damage, no interference with county infrastructure. Just block access to your property. The distinction mattered a lot. 3 days later, 2 flatbed trucks rolled onto my riverfront property carrying massive reinforced concrete barriers, the same type used on highway construction projects. Each block weighed several tons. I personally measured every placement. Twice. Then a third time. The barriers stretched across the bridge entrance precisely where the structure crossed onto my property. Nothing beyond that point, nothing before it. The bridge remained completely intact. The public road remained open. The river remained untouched. The only thing blocked was access across my land. By noon, residents began arriving. Some looked shocked. Others looked furious. A few simply stared. Word spread through Silver Creek Estates faster than wildfire. By dinner time, the entire neighborhood was talking about the concrete wall. Traffic backed up throughout the subdivision. Golf carts turned around, delivery trucks rerouted. Residents suddenly discovered how much they depended on the shortcut. My phone started ringing, then ringing again, then again. I ignored every unknown number. The following day, Silver Creek Estates looked completely different. For the first time since I returned, residents were openly questioning Victoria. The bridge had always been marketed as a community victory. Now, people wanted answers. One person asking questions became 10. 10 became 50. The pressure began spreading through the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Daniel Pierce was conducting investigations of his own. As a former financial analyst, Daniel approached problems differently than most people. He didn't chase rumors. He followed paperwork. 2 evenings after the barriers went up, Daniel called me. His voice sounded troubled. "Caleb, I found something." "What is it?" "I can't find the bridge permit." I sat upright. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly that." Daniel had spent 2 days reviewing HOA records, county filings, and archived meeting minutes. The permit wasn't missing. It appeared to have never existed. The construction approvals, the engineering reviews, the environmental reports, several required documents simply weren't there. Someone had apparently pushed the project forward without obtaining every approval normally required. The discovery made Daniel increasingly uncomfortable. And he wasn't the only one. Margaret Holloway had become surprisingly busy. At 73 years old, Margaret possessed the organizational skills of a military logistics officer. Within a week, she had assembled an informal group of frustrated residents, retirees, young families, property owners, people who previously never attended HOA meetings. Now they gathered weekly in church basements, coffee shops, and living rooms. What started as complaints about the bridge quickly expanded into questions about HOA finances. Where was the money going? Why had fees increased? Why were maintenance projects delayed? Why had residents never seen detailed financial reports? Questions multiplied. Answers remained scarce. Victoria, meanwhile, responded exactly as everyone expected. She became furious. Emails flooded resident inboxes. Official statements appeared on HOA social media pages. Emergency notices were distributed. Every message carried the same theme. The bridge blockade was selfish. The bridge blockade was harmful. The bridge blockade was unacceptable. None of the messages addressed ownership. None addressed permits. None addressed altered boundary lines. The more Victoria spoke, the more people noticed what she wasn't saying. 3 days later, I was drinking coffee on my porch when I heard an engine approaching. A white SUV appeared at the far end of the bridge. I immediately recognized it. Victoria's vehicle. The SUV accelerated across the structure. Residents followed behind on golf carts. Others arrived on foot. Within minutes, a crowd gathered near the concrete barriers. Victoria climbed out of the driver's seat. She looked different than she had during the HOA meeting. Less confident, more angry. The bright pink blazer remained. The designer sunglasses remained. The smile was gone. She marched directly toward the concrete wall, then toward me. People stopped talking. The entire riverbank seemed to fall silent. Victoria pointed at the barriers, then pointed directly at me. Her face flushed red. Her voice echoed across the water. "You can't do this." I remained seated. Victoria took another step forward, her finger still aimed at me. "You do not have the right to do this." And the crowd waited to see what would happen next. For a few seconds after Victoria shouted across the riverbank, nobody moved. The crowd stood frozen around the bridge entrance. Residents looked from Victoria to the concrete barriers and back again. I remained seated on my porch chair. The morning sun reflected off the Cumberland River behind me. Victoria looked like she was waiting for someone to rescue her authority. Nobody did. "You cannot block community infrastructure," she yelled. I pointed toward the survey stakes I had installed beside the barriers. I blocked my property. The distinction only made her angrier. Several residents had already pulled out their phones. They weren't filming me, they were filming her. That realization seemed to push Victoria over the edge. She spun around and marched back toward her white Dodge SUV. The vehicle was less than a year old, a fully loaded luxury model. Large chrome wheels, leather interior, custom paint protection. Exactly the type of vehicle Victoria loved showing off at HOA events. A few people thought she was leaving. I did too. Then she climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life. The crowd exchanged confused looks. One of the residents shouted her name. She ignored him. The SUV rolled backward several feet, then stopped. Victoria gripped the steering wheel. Her face looked completely different now. The carefully controlled HOA president was gone. In her place stood someone who had spent years getting her way and suddenly couldn't. Then she hit the accelerator. The SUV lunged forward. For a split second, I honestly thought she would stop. She didn't. The vehicle slammed directly into the reinforced concrete barriers. The impact echoed across the river. Metal screamed. Glass exploded. The front end crumpled like a soda can. Both airbags deployed instantly. White smoke filled the cabin. The crowd gasped. Several people screamed. Someone dropped a phone. Another resident shouted for an ambulance. Victoria stumbled out seconds later. Her pink blazer was covered in white airbag dust. Her designer sunglasses were gone. The front bumper of the SUV lay twisted beneath the barrier. The vehicle wasn't moving again anytime soon. For several seconds, she simply stared at the damage. Then she looked at me. I have never seen a human face contain that much anger. Her eyes filled with tears, not because she was injured, because she had lost, and hundreds of people had just witnessed it. Unfortunately for Victoria, nearly everyone had recorded the crash. Teenagers, retirees, parents, golf cart drivers. Within minutes, the videos began appearing online. By the time the tow truck arrived, clips were already spreading across local Facebook groups. By dinner time, the footage had reached neighboring counties. The title people kept using was simple: HOA president crashes SUV into property owner's barrier. The internet did the rest. Meanwhile, another story was quietly developing behind the scenes. Daniel Pierce had spent most of the previous week preparing for exactly this possibility. If Victoria lost control publicly, Daniel suspected she would become even more reckless privately. He decided to protect himself. Daniel spent an entire night backing up HOA financial records, bank statements, expense reports, vendor invoices, construction contracts, meeting minutes, everything. Using a portable hard drive, he copied years of records from HOA computers before anyone could delete them. The deeper he looked, the more uncomfortable he became. Certain numbers didn't make sense. Certain payments lacked explanations. Certain contractors appeared repeatedly. But Daniel wasn't ready to draw conclusions yet. For now, he simply preserved the evidence. Elsewhere, Margaret Holloway was making moves of her own. Margaret had lived long enough to recognize when a story was bigger than a neighborhood argument. 3 days earlier, she had contacted someone she trusted, a local investigative reporter named Lauren Bishop. Lauren was 36 years old with shoulder-length brown hair, sharp features, and the relentless curiosity that had earned her multiple regional journalism awards. Her father had once lost his family business to municipal corruption, and ever since then she had made a career out of exposing people who abused power. Margaret forwarded emails, meeting notices, HOA communications, property records. Lauren immediately became interested, especially after seeing footage of the bridge dispute. By the afternoon of the crash, she was already requesting public records from multiple agencies. While all of that unfolded, Deputy Ethan Brooks received a dispatch call. The report sounded ridiculous. Property dispute, vehicle collision, potential disturbance, multiple witnesses, possible HOA involvement. Ethan immediately knew where he was going. When he arrived near the river, he found dozens of residents standing around the damaged SUV. Several people were talking at once. Several others were still filming. Victoria was pacing beside her vehicle while making phone calls. The moment she saw Ethan's patrol truck, she pointed directly at me. Then she pointed again and again, as if repeating the gesture would somehow change reality. Within minutes, additional units were dispatched. The situation was attracting attention fast. The crash video was already spreading online. Residents were arguing. Traffic was backing up. The county wanted answers. I stood beside the concrete barriers watching everything unfold. The river remained calm. The bridge remained intact. The barrier remained exactly where the survey markers said it belonged. Then the sound of sirens echoed through the valley. One patrol vehicle appeared, then another, then a third. The crowd stepped aside as 3 police cruisers rolled toward the bridge entrance. Victoria immediately marched forward. She pointed directly at me. Her voice carried across the riverbank. "Arrest him right now! Arrest him right now!" Victoria's voice echoed across the riverbank as the 3 patrol cars rolled to a stop near the bridge entrance. The crowd immediately parted. Residents pulled out more phones. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Victoria stormed toward the officers before they even stepped out of their vehicles. Her pink blazer was stained with airbag dust. Her makeup had partially run from tears. The destroyed SUV sat behind her like evidence nobody could ignore. "He blocked community infrastructure," she pointed at me. "He damaged property," she pointed again. "He's threatening residents." Deputy Ethan Brooks listened without interrupting. That alone seemed to frustrate Victoria. The other 2 deputies exchanged glances. Neither looked particularly convinced. I remained standing beside the concrete barriers. Then I picked up my father's old leather document case, the same one I had carried into the HOA meeting. Without saying a word, I walked toward the nearest patrol vehicle. Several residents followed. Ethan followed. Victoria followed. The crowd moved with us. I spread a large survey map across the hood of Ethan's cruiser. The paper fluttered slightly in the river breeze. Then I placed another document beside it, and another. Property surveys, county GIS overlays, boundary descriptions, ownership records. Every document told the same story. I pointed toward the bridge. Here. Then toward the survey. And here. Every property marker matched. Every coordinate matched. Every legal description matched. I showed Ethan the original boundary monuments established years earlier, then the GPS coordinates, then the county certified survey. Everything led to one conclusion. The bridge sat on my land. Victoria tried interrupting twice. Ethan stopped her both times. Finally, he took out his phone. "If these documents are legitimate, verification will be simple." Victoria crossed her arms. The confidence that usually surrounded her seemed noticeably weaker now. Ethan called the county property records office. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Several residents stood close enough to hear portions of it. Parcel numbers, coordinates, survey references, boundary descriptions. The answers kept coming back exactly the same. When Ethan ended the call, the silence around us became almost uncomfortable. He looked at the bridge, then at Victoria, then back at the documents. The expression on Victoria's face changed. For the first time since this entire situation began, she looked nervous. Not angry, not arrogant. Nervous. Because reality had become harder to ignore. Unfortunately for her, that wasn't the only problem arriving that afternoon. A dark news van pulled into the parking area beside the bridge. Lauren Bishop stepped out carrying a microphone. The investigative reporter Margaret had contacted moved quickly. Lauren's shoulder-length brown hair blew in the wind as she approached the crowd. A cameraman followed close behind. His name was Kevin Morales, a quiet man in his 40s with years of experience covering political scandals throughout Tennessee. The moment residents saw the television crew, conversations erupted everywhere. Lauren immediately began interviewing witnesses. Many were eager to talk, especially after the SUV crash. Meanwhile, Daniel Pierce decided he was finished staying quiet. For weeks, he had debated what to do. Now, he made his choice. Daniel arrived carrying a laptop and several storage drives. His face looked exhausted, but also relieved. He handed copies of thousands of HOA emails to Lauren. Board communications, financial discussions, internal reports, meeting records, years of correspondence. The documents painted a devastating picture. Victoria had known about the ownership dispute long before construction began. Several emails discussed property boundaries. Several mentioned legal risks. One specifically referenced concerns about Caleb Mercer's ownership records. The warnings had been ignored. The financial records looked even worse. Invoices, transfers, construction payments, budget reallocations. Over $700,000 collected from residents had been redirected into bridge-related expenses. Money originally approved for community projects, playground upgrades, road repairs, drainage improvements. Residents standing nearby listened as pieces of the information became public. The reactions were immediate: shock, confusion, anger. Questions began flying toward Victoria from every direction. She attempted to answer some, avoided others, denied most. But the confidence was gone. The woman who had controlled every HOA meeting now seemed unable to control the crowd standing in front of her. Lauren's camera captured all of it. Every question, every response, every uncomfortable silence. Then she turned toward Ethan. The microphone moved into frame. The camera light switched on. The crowd became quiet. Victoria looked desperately hopeful. Perhaps she still believed law enforcement would somehow validate her position. Instead, Ethan glanced once more at the survey document spread across the cruiser's hood. Then he looked directly into the camera. It appears the property records are very clear. Nobody said a word. Even the river seemed quiet. Ethan nodded toward me, then toward the bridge, and finally toward Victoria. There is one thing I can say right now. The camera stayed fixed on him. So far, it looks like the person who needs to explain this situation isn't Mr. Mercer. And standing in front of a television camera, Victoria Langford suddenly looked like a woman running out of places to hide. The investigation started less than 48 hours after Ethan's statement aired on local television. Once the cameras exposed the bridge dispute, the story moved beyond Silver Creek Estates. County officials became involved. Attorneys became involved. Auditors became involved. And for the first time in years, people began examining Victoria Langford's decisions instead of simply accepting them. The first discovery came from county planning records. Several documents submitted during the bridge project contained altered boundary information. The survey discrepancies Daniel had uncovered were only the beginning. Investigators found multiple versions of the same construction paperwork. Each version told a slightly different story. The original property lines had gradually shifted on later submissions until the bridge appeared to avoid my land altogether. That alone triggered a formal fraud investigation. Then the financial review began. The numbers were worse than anyone expected. Money approved for playground renovations had been redirected. Money intended for drainage improvements had disappeared. Money collected through HOA assessments had funded bridge construction expenses residents never voted on. The deeper auditors looked, the uglier it became. Competitive bidding requirements had been bypassed. Contracts had been awarded without proper review. Several payments appeared connected to companies with personal relationships to HOA leadership. The construction firm responsible for the bridge suddenly found itself answering difficult questions. Within weeks, county regulators imposed penalties related to permit violations and improper filings. The company publicly blamed incomplete information provided during the approval process. Nobody seemed eager to defend Victoria anymore. Her allies slowly disappeared. Board members resigned. Committee members stopped returning calls. Residents who once applauded her speeches suddenly claimed they had always questioned the project. Power has a funny way of evaporating when consequences arrive. Victoria's resignation happened during an emergency HOA meeting held in the same clubhouse where she had laughed at my deed. This time, nobody laughed. She stood before a room filled with angry homeowners. The confidence was gone. The pink blazer was gone. Even her voice sounded smaller. When the vote came, the result was overwhelming. Her leadership was finished. The civil lawsuits followed shortly afterward. The HOA's insurance attorneys negotiated settlements. Multiple claims moved through court. In the end, the HOA became responsible for covering my legal expenses. Every dollar Rebecca Foster had billed during the dispute was reimbursed. When I called Rebecca to tell her the news, she simply laughed. "Caleb, I've spent 25 years watching HOA presidents think they're smarter than property law. How often does it end this badly? Not often enough." The community, however, was changing. Daniel Pierce was elected the new HOA president. The position was never something he wanted, but after everything that happened, residents trusted him. Daniel approached leadership the same way he approached accounting, carefully, methodically, without drama. Margaret Holloway won a seat on the Resident Advisory Council. The 73-year-old widow became surprisingly popular. Residents appreciated her honesty. She had spent years warning people about problems others ignored. Now people finally listened. Deputy Ethan Brooks helped organize something nobody had ever seriously discussed before: financial transparency. Monthly reports, public access to budgets, independent reviews of major projects. The program wasn't flashy, but it restored trust. For the first time, homeowners could see exactly where their money was going. The biggest surprise came from the bridge itself. Many residents assumed I would demand its removal. Legally, I probably could have. Instead, I proposed something different: a 20-year land use lease. The bridge would stay. The HOA would pay annual rent for the portion crossing my property. Everything would be documented. Everything would be legal. Everything would be transparent. The residents overwhelmingly approved the agreement. Part of the lease revenue funded repairs to the community playground. Part reduced HOA fees. Part supported local veterans programs. The bridge finally started benefiting the people it was always supposed to serve. As for me, I finally built the project my father had dreamed about. The Mercer Veterans Workshop rose beside the river. Steel beams, large garage doors, machine tools, training areas, a place where veterans could learn skills, repair equipment, and spend time with people who understood them. Construction took nearly a year. When the grand opening finally arrived, hundreds of residents attended. The same bridge that once divided the community now carried visitors toward the celebration. Children crossed it carrying balloons. Veterans crossed it wearing old service caps. Families crossed it together. Margaret Holloway stood at the ribbon with oversized ceremonial scissors. At 74, she looked happier than I had ever seen her. Daniel stood nearby, smiling. When the ribbon finally fell, he glanced toward the bridge, then toward the crowd, then toward me. "You know," he said, shaking his head, "this is the first time that bridge has actually connected the community." Everyone laughed, including me. Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed, I walked onto the bridge alone. The river flowed quietly beneath me. The sunset reflected across the water. For a long time, I simply stood there. A year earlier, that bridge had represented greed, arrogance, power, everything that had gone wrong. Now it represented something else: accountability, trust, second chances. The community had chosen truth over authority, and because of that choice, the bridge finally became what it should have been from the beginning. Not a monument to someone's ego, but a connection between neighbors. The lesson in this story is not really about a bridge, an HOA, or even a property dispute. It is about what happens when people stop asking questions and allow power to to go unchecked. In everyday life, most of us will never deal with a $1 million bridge built on our land. But we will all face moments when someone tries to convince us that we should stay quiet, look the other way, or accept something that simply is not right. Caleb never won because he was louder than Victoria. He won because he stayed calm, kept records, learned the facts, and refused to give up when the truth was on his side. That lesson applies everywhere. In our families, our workplaces, our communities, and our friendships. Integrity may not always win quickly, but it has a way of winning eventually. And sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is stand firm without becoming bitter. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need the reminder that honesty still matters, and that standing up for what is right is always worth it. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what part of Caleb's journey stood out to you the most. If you enjoy stories about justice, courage, and ordinary people overcoming impossible situations, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story. May God bless you, your family, your home, and everyone you love. May He give you strength during difficult times, wisdom when facing challenges, and peace in your heart no matter what comes your way. And if you believe that truth is stronger than power, leave an amen in the comments. God bless you all. Amen.